"Torkel," he said, "we have some exciting news for you." He stopped. He didn't sound excited, so I waited for what was to come next. "Uncle Svein has asked us if you would like to go with him on his next voyage down to Denmark, just to see a bit of the world," said my mother. She saw me hesitate. "It would only be for a few weeks," she went on, "just to drop off the cargo he has on board now and pick up some other things to bring back up this way." Still I said nothing, but a small seed of interest took root. If it was only for a few weeks, then I was sure I could bear that. And Mother was right. It would be interesting to see and do something else out of the ordinary. "Will I be part of your crew?" I asked my uncle. He smiled, something he was not used to doing, and there was a shifty expression in his eyes, but he looked that way most of the time, so I took no notice. "If you like," he said, "that's up to you. I have enough men to row the ship when necessary, but most of the time we can use the sails." He paused. "What do you think? Would you like that?" And so it was that some 2 hours later, when we had all had something to eat, I followed Svein down to his boat with a small bag of extra clothes over my back and climbed on board. It was difficult to know where to put myself, so full was the hold with bundles of seal hides, boxes of walrus ivory and barrels of dried fish. I stood on the wooden platform at the rear of the ship and listened to the splash of the oars as they dipped in and out of the water, watching my family on the jetty growing smaller and smaller in the dwindling light of day. I waved one last time, but by then they had turned away and didn't see me. "Where are we going, Uncle?" I asked when I could no longer see my family. Ahead the sky was darkening, and a sharp wind ruffled the surface of the water as we neared the mouth of the fjord. Svein laughed. It was a wintry sound with no mirth in it. I caught a smirk on the face of Alfmund, who stood on the rear deck, holding onto the steering paddle that would guide our ship. He looked amused too, but it wasn't friendly. "Hedeby," said my uncle, and then added, "if the bad weather ahead doesn't sink us." The men at the oars were clearly anxious and heaved the ship round so that the wind which came roaring down from the north behind us would catch the sail which was being pulled up to the crossbeam above. The boat bucked like a wild horse. For a moment I thought I would die as a huge wave hit us amidships and crashed against our side. "Bail!" one of the rowers yelled at me, throwing a bucket which nearly sent me overboard. I jumped down into the bilges of the boat, and wherever I could find a gap between the barrels that filled the hole, I swished my bucket through the freezing water and poured it overboard. Hedeby, my uncle had said, it meant nothing to me. Of course I had heard of other places in Norway, Tønsberg, Bergen, Trondheim, but no one had ever mentioned a place called Hedeby. We sailed for what felt like forever, but could only have been a couple of hours, when my uncle decided it was too dangerous to go on through the night with so many hidden rocks and skerries which could dash the boat to pieces in the dark. We found an island which gave us some shelter from the wildness of the wind and water, and threw over an anchor near a small cove on the lee side. Even so, the ship rocked alarmingly all night, and I was glad when streaks of grey appeared on the eastern horizon. The next 3 days were not much better. Each evening we sought shelter. Sailing through the night near a coastline was always dangerous, my uncle told me, though out on the open sea it was less so. On the morning of the 3rd day we turned southwest, leaving the comforting presence of land behind us. The wind had died a little, though it was still strong enough to send Slider forward like an unleashed hunting dog. I gave up trying to ask questions or talk to anyone. The crew were a surly lot, and I couldn't understand what many of them said anyway. They spoke a different language from me, and I guessed they were not from Norway, Denmark or Sweden, but somewhere further south. Several of them had dark skins and black hair that whipped across their faces in the wind. They stank too. It wasn't until I noticed the iron shackles round their ankles that I realised what they were. Thralls. Slaves. My uncle was using slaves to run his trade. I felt ashamed and moved away from the men. I hoped they didn't know I was related to Svein. They must have been very wicked men, I thought. Criminals, perhaps, and this was their punishment. It wasn't until later that I learned that most thralls were not bad people at all, just unlucky to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. One in particular looked not many years older than me, and I wondered what he could have done to end up on my uncle's ship. I tried to talk to him, but he shook his head and glanced fearfully at Alfmund, who carried a whip stuck into his belt and wasn't afraid to use it, mostly because he enjoyed being cruel. About midday I noticed we could see land on either side of the boat, and we sailed in closer to the right-hand side. There were no mountains, just flat pasture land or scrub, and sometimes a low hill. "Denmark," said my uncle, seeing I was looking closely. "Another few hours and we should be at Hedeby." There was a sharp rain falling, which, along with the flying sea spray, drenched us all. I huddled into the shelter of the deck, among the goods which Slider was carrying, and passed the time dozing and listening to the creak of the ship and Alfmund's footsteps above my head as he guided us down towards our destination. Late in the afternoon the rain ceased, and I saw we were approaching a wide river mouth. The crew pulled the sail down and took the oars to navigate the shallows and avoid the mud flats on either side. I crawled out from my shelter and saw houses, more houses than I'd ever seen before, clustered along the water's edge, and countless jetties running out into the river. Tied up to them were dozens of ships, mostly knarrs like Slider, but also one or two longships, lean, ocean-going fighting vessels that could hold 40 men at the oars and 20 or 30 more Viking warriors. I half expected to see the fearsome dragon-carved prows that were fixed to the front of the ships when they were entered enemy waters, but remembered that these are removed in friendly territory. Alfmund shouted, "Ship oars!" and the rowers pulled in their blades. We glided in and bumped alongside one of the jetties. Svein stepped off and tied the ship to a wooden post. "Come on," he said to me, "I have business to do." I stood there, transfixed by the number of people bustling about, hundreds and hundreds of them, and he grabbed my shoulder and gave me a jerk. "Stop gawping and hurry up," he said. I scrambled onto the jetty and followed him as he set off at a fast pace. He wove his way between the houses and storage sheds that lined the creek. I could smell fish and animal skins, wood smoke and unwashed human bodies, stale with sweat and beer. And over all of this, the endless squawking of gulls, fighting each other for food scraps. It was good to be out of the ship and walking again, although I had to hurry to keep up with him. In a few minutes he had disappeared into the doorway of one of the long houses near the end of what seemed to be the main street. It took me some moments to adjust to the darkness of the interior. There were 20 or more men arguing loudly, and a group of mostly women and children huddled into a corner. They looked frightened and confused, and many of them were weeping in utter despair. It was clear my uncle was well known. Several of the men broke off their arguing and came towards us. "Svein," one of them said, embracing him. He was the strangest man I had ever seen. On his head he wore a long piece of cloth, wound round and round and tucked in at the back so it wouldn't unravel, and over whatever clothes he had underneath was a floor-length loose white tunic which floated out each time he turned, as though he was a swan about to take flight. His skin was dark, and his black eyes glittered even in that gloom. He reminded me of a hawk, with his thin, hooked nose, and his hands fluttered about constantly as he talked. My uncle turned to me. "Go and sit over there with the women and children while I talk to Omar," he said, shoving me away. People looked at me and I felt self-conscious about the way I walked with my limp. However hard I tried, I could never quite walk the way other people did. I couldn't hear what my uncle was talking about, but I supposed he was bartering with the stranger about the goods we carried and others that we might buy from him. He clearly wasn't Norwegian, though he was quite able to speak to my uncle. Sometimes one of the men would fetch some of the women and children from the group I was with, and they would cringe as a stranger examined them, turning them round and sometimes pinching their arms or legs. I could see silver was changing hands, and, like a hammer blow, I realised what was happening. It was not just fish or pelts or iron ore or any of the numerous goods moving constantly from east to west, north to south, and the livestock was not only horses, cattle or goats. I moved nearer the door, unwilling to stay near these poor people, but my uncle caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. "Come here, Torkel," he called above the din of men arguing, women and children crying. "Look," he said to the swarthy man with a cloth round his head. "What do you think of this one?" He smiled. I thought it was a tasteless joke, but he suddenly pulled me forwards and thrust me towards the man. "Uncle," I said, and laughed nervously. This was taking the joke a bit far. "Shut up," he snarled at me. "Why doesn't he walk properly?" asked the other man. "He has a club foot," began my uncle, but the other man held up his hand. "He's a cripple. Why would I want to buy a cripple?" He paused and took my chin in his hand. His fingers gripped my jaw tightly, and he turned my head this way and that, examining me with eyes like chips of jet. "He's too dark," he said eventually. "I need lighter-haired ones, and anyway, no one will want a cripple." He turned away. "Wait, Omar," said my uncle, but the man had joined a group who were haggling over some blonde-haired children. I stared at Uncle Svein in horror. For a moment it had looked seriously as though he was going to sell me. "Right," he said, his voice grim. "We'll lower the odds." He pulled me out of the door and, keeping a grip on my arm, dragged me round the back of the building where another group of men were loading a trading ship tied to one of the jetties. "Hey, Björn," he called, and a tall man with a greasy brown beard, plaited and tied with a piece of deer thong, came forward. "What have you here?" he said, peering down at me. "A strong young lad," Svein said. "He's called Torkel. Look at these arm muscles. They'll row your ship well. And another thing," he went on, "he's a skilled smith. He can make anything with iron or steel." Björn took my upper arm himself and gripped my biceps hard. I tried to squirm away. My uncle shot his hand out and gave me a hard slap on the side of my face. "Manners, boy," he said. I reeled back from the blow, my ears ringing, and I stumbled awkwardly on my club foot. "Yes," said my uncle, noticing Björn's expression. "He's crippled, but not so badly that he can't walk or swing a hammer in a forge." "How much?" asked Björn. 8 ounces of silver." "2," said Björn. 8 is a good price for a full-grown man." 5, said my uncle. 4, and that's my limit." All this passed in seconds. Shock had made me dumb with disbelief. Money changed hands, but before he went, my uncle drew out his knife, rolled my sleeve up on my left arm, and with the point of the blade carved a T into my skin. He bent down, scooped up some dirt and rubbed it into the bleeding wound. "There," he said, "that's what you are now, a thrall. Maybe the wound will get infected and you'll die, or maybe you'll wish you had. No more snooping round corners for you, little sneak." And he laughed with grim pleasure. He turned away, and at last I found my voice. I tried to control the wobble. "What will you say to my mother when I don't go home?" I called out to his retreating back. "I'll tell her you fell overboard and drowned," he flung over his shoulder without bothering to turn. As I watched him go, I felt someone put a rope round my neck, and I swung round. One of the crew pulled the knot tight and tugged on it, making me fall forwards. The other men laughed at my anger and shame, and before I could stop them, tears sprang to my eyes. The rough planks of the jetty were slick with fish scales, and I scrabbled to find something to hold on to so that I could get up. A hand came out and yanked on the back of my tunic, pulling me to my feet. "You're too soft, Rowan," said Björn, and I turned to thank my rescuer. He was about my height, lean and muscled, with a square face and the whitest hair and skin I'd ever seen. Even his eyes were almost colourless. But it wasn't age. He couldn't have been older than his early 20s. Unlike the others, he was not laughing at me, and that small act of kindness helped me to pull myself together. Björn noticed my shocked stare. "We call him the Ghost," he said. "He frightens people to death, but he's also like lightning with a short sword." "We must wash the wound, Rowans," the ghost man said, pointing at where the blood was seeping into the sleeve of my shirt. "It will become poisoned." I could hardly understand the way he spoke, so thick was his accent, but I realised what he meant. He took a small bucket that was near the prow of the ship and scooped water from between the ship and the jetty. "Pull up your sleeve," he said, and splashed the water down my arm. The water didn't look much cleaner than the mud my uncle had smeared on my arm, but it might have helped a little. The rest of the crew continued to load the ship, and in a short while Björn was ready to leave. He pointed to a box beside one of the oars and pushed me towards it. "That's your oar whenever we have to row," he said. Then he laughed. "Mind you, you won't be going anywhere when you aren't rowing," and he nodded to another man. "Shackle him," he said, and turned away. He went back up onto the rear deck to speak to the steerboard man. My ankles were locked into bands of iron, attached by a short chain to another which ran the length of the ship. Half of the rowers had their legs shackled, while the other half seemed to be free to get up and move about if they wanted. I leaned forward and spoke to the man in front, his legs also in irons. "What happens if the ship goes down?" I asked, wondering how I would escape the leg irons. "We go down with it," he said. "They won't bother with us." I pulled on my oar along with the others, and gradually the boat moved out into the main channel, where we turned towards the mouth of the river. As the town slipped past us, I watched to see if I could catch sight of my uncle. But although we passed his ship Slider, still tied up at the jetty, he was nowhere to be seen. He was probably in one of the ale-houses in the town, feeling smug about having gained 4 ounces of silver for so little effort. I pushed the thought of my parents' grief out of my mind and checked the sob rising in my throat.